Well, I just want to say thank you to Constance again, and I think to her point about us really collaborating together, this conference wouldn't happen without so many people doing that, including all of the speakers who really were very much part of the conversation on what we were going to have. So I want to welcome to the stage here, we have Mary Kissel, John Dawson, and Tony Nash. And I wanted to give just also a special thanks to Mary, because when this event was first conceived the first time around about a year and a half ago, I remember it started with a Zoom call with me and John Hartley and Mary talking about what this conference and this forum could be. And then she introduced us to so many people that were part of this last year. She was supposed to be here last year, but got what some might call the China virus just before. And she was supposed to talk about China, so I thought that was ironic. But anyway, here they are. We are going to talk about China's Latin American ambitions. And also, we're grateful for Tony from coming in from Texas. And also, John Dawson, a former Bloomberg TV anchor, now has his own strategy firm, Acara Strategy, and also a member of the Economic Club of Miami. So thank you, John. Take it away.
Thank you, Francisco. Can we all hear me? And a shout out to Mike from Bloomberg. He's still here. Where is he? He's gone. Is he gone? Anyway, thanks for having me. I'm not wearing red because I'm Chinese, but I did live in Hong Kong for 11 years. I wear red socks because my dad used to wear red socks. But I'm going to open with a couple of headlines because I'm a news guy. And thank you very much, Mary and Tony. Mary was in Hong Kong for 6.5 years, and Tony was in Asia for 15. So I was there for 11.5. So we've all got that kind of lens through China and Asia. But overnight, just to add that the Panamanian president, Mr. Molino, has accused the U.S. of spreading, and I quote, lies and falsehoods on the claim that U.S. government vessels are going through the canal with no fee. He and President Trump are speaking today. That'll be an interesting conversation. Meanwhile, in the Dominican Republic, the U.S. has seized a second plane of the Venezuelan President Maduro. So that's happened today. And of course, a couple of days ago, Mexico imposed tariffs on China of 19%. There's a change. And we're also going to add something else, that in the year of the snake, President Xi, not president, as Mary will correct me, Premier Xi, was born in the year of the snake, and Donald Trump was born in the year of the dog. And apparently, according to the Zodiac, they actually get on. So that's another little Zodiac thought. But I want to start just talking about, that was a very good presentation from Constance there, and a really nice segue into what we're going to talk about. Thank you, Constance, for that. I think it's just interesting, your point of view, Mary, first of all, having lived there and looking through the lens. This talk is about foreign policy and how it intersects with China and the US in Latin America. What will the next 4 years administration, or is it too far to look down the lens of, look like? And will China's grip significantly loosen on the territory?
No. Before I answer more of your question, I just want to say thank you to the Miami Economic Forum, to John. I am a Floridian. My grandparents came here in the 40s. My parents are graduates of FAU. So it's a really special pleasure for me to be here, along with old friends Tony, Amity, and Constance. Thank you for your remarks. I think to answer your question, I just want to make a couple of notes. I was very deeply involved in the reorientation of U.S. policy toward China. I was the right hand to Secretary Pompeo. I think as business people, as investors, I think we're very used to thinking about the world in silos. You look at economic data, you do due diligence on a company, you're a board, you're thinking about your shareholder value. But really, you can't think about investment strategies without understanding the incentive structure. And the incentive structure in all of these countries that we're speaking about is determined by political actors. And so I think what we've discovered, vis-a-vis China in particular, you've asked me that, John, is that for 40 years, we entirely forgot to do basic, prudent due diligence because we ignored the nature of the regime. And we can't ignore the nature of the regime anymore. And so, when you ask, what do the next 4 years look like? Typically, that's answered by looking at the United States. To answer that question, you have to look at the nature of communist China and the history of their action. It's not a political issue, it's not a partisan issue. And it's very clear the goals of the Communist Party and the trajectory of the party. They are not reformers. There is no private sector. There's no chance of reform. There's no chance of opening up. They don't honor any agreement that they sign. And so if you want to know what the next 4 years is likely to look like, then you have to understand that regime, what they have done, and what they say they're going to do in the future. So I think President Trump would love to do deals with Beijing. He's a deal maker. I think he's going to have a tough time, not because of his intent, but because of what they'll do.
What's behind, do you think, if President Trump was saying he would impose 60% tariffs and it's actually 10% at the moment? What do you think is happening in Beijing right now? What's the conversation like? And then Tony will come to you. Mary first. All right, Tony?
Okay, great, John, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for the participation here. I'm really glad to be here. I'm really glad to be here with John and Mary. So there are two experiences that I have that are very relevant to the current experience. First is I advised the NDRC in China on the Belt and Road Initiative for the first 2 years. So I was in Beijing advising the NDRC. I was never paid by the Chinese government. They never even reimbursed my expenses. But I was fascinated to understand how the Chinese bureaucracy works, okay? So that's one point. The other point is, in the 2016 election, I was very close with the deputy ambassador in DC, and we were on the phone the night of the election in 2016. They were absolutely shocked. They had done no preparation whatsoever for a Trump administration in Beijing. And the last point is, in January of 2017, I was in Beijing talking with the NDRC. So the NDRC is the economic planner in China. They plan the entire economy. Giving a presentation to the NDRC and the largest think tanks in Beijing on what a new Trump regime would bring. And I told them, these were not state secrets. All this stuff was on the Trump website, right? And I said, this is what he's going to do. And they were shocked. They said, there's no way he's going to do that. So in 2016-17, the Chinese government had done zero preparation for Trump imposing tariffs, zero. They just incredulously didn't believe he would do that. And so now I think they've done more preparation. Of course they have. And what I've been saying since the election is the following. China will vocally and aggressively oppose Trump's actions for the first 3 to 6 months. But behind the scenes, I believe they'll be aligning with what Trump wants. So both sides have to play to their home camp. China's a very nationalistic economy. I know we hear all sorts of accusation that the US is nationalistic now and all this stuff, but China, India, Japan, Korea, every nation in Asia is nationalistic. So China has to play to their nationalistic roots, and they'll do that for 3 to 6 months. And after that, I believe they'll align quite a lot with what the US wants.
But the tariff issue, I think, John, raises a really difficult... Did they take my mic away? No.
Cutting you off, Mary.
Yeah, it happens to me on the phone a lot.
It's a hidden strategy just to cut you off.
It is. But you know, in terms of China and tariffs, you know, it's a difficult conundrum for the U.S. government. What do you do when the world's second largest economy, an integral part of the WTO, just ignores all the rules? There's no exit mechanism. And so, you know, I'm a free trader, like Amity. I mean, I was on the Journal editorial board. I love free trade. But I don't think there's a right answer. And so part of the reason why we're having this panel on their Latin American ambitions is because as countries wake up and they realize the threat that's being posed, you know, China's looking for other avenues. And of course, Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean, right? This is in the whole Belt and Road Initiative is a way to decouple from us. They want to decouple from us. It's official policy. We're not decoupling from them, they're decoupling from us. You know, you can't think of the world in a bilateral way. The world is changing. It's moving into blocks. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Pakistan, Africa, certain nations of our hemisphere. They're creating an alternate economy so that they can pull away from us.
Before we go into Latin America in more detail, on Monday, China imposes, I think it's $14 billion equivalent on 80 products from the US. So it's a kind of retaliation. I want to ask you both, is just the kind of what's going to happen in the next 6 months? Is it going to be, we're going to increase the tariffs from this side, and then, okay, fine, have this, then have that, and it's a huge sparring match, basically.
It's a great question. There was a very interesting study published by the U.S. Department of Commerce, so this is under the Biden administration, about the impact of tariffs on Chinese steel in 2017-18. And what we saw was those prices rose for a short period of time, 6 to 8 weeks. After that time, those prices reverted to the global average price of steel. So what happened there? China is an export-dependent country. They're a subsidy-heavy exporter. So in that time, they organized their subsidy regime to basically absorb that tariff. So any export-dependent country will absorb the tariff, and this goes back to 1920s economic theory. It's not, I don't believe that such a thing as free trade actually exists. I think that's a 1980s pipe dream. So when we look back to, say, 1920s tariff discussions, that was maybe not the same words they would use, but that was the theory they had. Because the exporting country has a dependency on the importing country, and they'll find a way to make it up. So we hear all the time, a tariff is a tax on the importing country. It is for a very short period of time as markets adjust. But after that, the exporting country, if they're interested, they put in subsidies.
Yeah, and we also hear, tariff and Trump always in the same sentence. The problem here is not Trump. The problem is the behavior of China. The reason the tariff regime was put into place was because of their behavior, not because we wanted to do it, not because we wanted disruption in trade. And I can tell you that because I served in the first term. So if you don't like the tariff regime, then you need to exert pressure and leverage to get their behavior to change. And I don't love tariffs. I wish there were other ways. I think we can have offensive mechanisms to attract capital to the United States out of China. But look, the companies that I talk to, they're leaving. Look at the FDI numbers. People get the joke. So the only companies that are investing heavily are the Europeans, because they're still living in the alternate universe. They think China is a great investment opportunity. And the Fortune 500 companies that have invested so heavily that they can't afford to get out, but everybody else is getting out. Anybody below that is getting out. You just don't read about it because the Journal and the Times, et cetera, only focus on the largest companies. But American corporates are a much bigger universe than that, and you can see that in the FDI.
But with China having a large trade imbalance, they can't afford a trade war. So therefore, does Donald Trump have a much stronger negotiating footing than 8 years ago, for example? Is it much stronger now than it
Yes,
was?
he does, but it's in China's interest to drag it out and to distract us, which is what they did in the first term. Because if you spend 3 years, like Steve Mnuchin did, right, negotiating an ultimately fruitless deal, that gives them 3 years to build their military, 3 years to develop Belt and Road.
They've already been building
Right, and we should talk about that, although unfortunately it's not the topic today. But it's in their interest to just drag it out to get status quo and to not get more levies put on them. That's their strategy.
Can I just, I'm going to talk about the Belt and Road, and then I'm going to segue it to Latin America. How about that? Please. Okay. So one of the things that we all have to understand about the Belt and Road is that 70% of the loans that are put out under the Belt and Road Initiative are US dollar denominated, okay? They are not CNY denominated. They are not local currency denominated. 70% of them are US dollar denominated. So we have the dollar trading right now. If you look at DXY, it's at 107, 108, something like that. It wouldn't take much to push that up to, say, 112, 113, 114. Once you do that, all of these emerging markets default. China's Export-Import Bank is in a huge amount of trouble. China Development Bank is in a huge amount of trouble. So if you look at a place like Venezuela with $50 billion of debt to China, all Scott Bessent has to do is push DXY up to 112, 113, 114. Venezuela's bankrupt. China is in a world of hurt, and a lot of other countries are hurting too. So it doesn't take a lot for the US to push China over the edge. So moving to BRI in Latin America, yes, there are a lot of countries who have what are Belt and Road Initiative projects. I was there at the beginning. This was a very interesting vision for what they want. It has really turned into just corruption. I mean, look at the stuff we've seen about USAID over the last 2 days or whatever, right? One of the things I tried to do there was to put a tendering website, a transparent tendering website there. And my question to them was, how much corruption are you comfortable with? 5%, 30%, 50%? How much corruption are you comfortable with? They didn't like that, as you can imagine. So we didn't do that. But you have to understand that these Belt and Road loans are inflated. I would guess that at least 40% is being pushed off the table to corruption. That suits Venezuela well. That suits China well. And so, but I think as we look at Belt and Road Initiative, look at Mexico coming out of Belt and Road, or Panama, sorry, coming out of Belt and Road, right? These countries are realizing that they are competitors with China. Mexico and China are natural trade competitors. They are not partners. If we look at, say, the import of televisions from into the US, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago. Before that, most of our televisions were imported from China. As of 6 or 7 years ago, most of our televisions are imported from Mexico. So I've heard people for years say Mexico is going to partner with China and ruin the US. That would be the stupidest thing for the Mexican economic planners and president to do, because they are the most natural trade competitors that I see in the world right now.
Evaluating China's influence in the whole region, there are 13 countries in the BRI. I think your map, Constance, sort of planned it out pretty perfectly. It's a pretty significant influence. If Mexico are imposing tariffs on China, will that be the beginning of the other countries in the region doing the same? Is that the negotiating tactic for the Venezuelas or Argentinas or?
Venezuela can't.
Right.
They absolutely can't. Argentina can. Colombia, it's questionable. So I think it's a case-by-case basis, but Venezuela absolutely
So Mexico
cannot.
can, but it's really on its own.
Mexico can, because they're competitors. And I think what they've learned just over the past couple of days is it's to their advantage.
To please President Trump.
To please the U.S.
Yeah.
and American companies, because if we're going to just import Chinese goods to reassemble them in Mexico to export them to the U.S., to be honest, imposing those tariffs is a revenue opportunity for the Mexican Ministry of Finance, right? And it also helps American companies know that these components in their manufacturing are actually made in Mexico instead of made in China.
Okay, talk to me about Panama. So it's a 51-mile canal. They've got Chinese, it's owned by Hutchison Whampoa, which is actually a Hong Kong business, but Chinese, obviously now. The Chinese embassy, or China was building an embassy at one point, that's been scrapped, I think. There's a huge conference center. It's basically, from the beginning to the end, it's a very Chinese experience. So that's going to change, I assume, significantly, right, Mary?
Well, it's just to go back to where I started, which is, we need to see the world as it is. What we're seeing in real time is the sorting of nations between the free nations of the West and the China-led unfree coalition. And what President Trump is essentially doing, whether it's Panama or our overtures to Greenland, et cetera, is saying, we want to live in a free hemisphere. We're going to assert our influence to ensure it remains so. And nations like Panama are going to have to choose whether they want to be with us or whether they want to be with the Venezuelas and the Colombias, et cetera, of the world. And I think, ultimately, if you do business and you do business in an uncorrupt way, that's a good thing for you. I'm skeptical of, what Panama is actually, quote unquote, giving up here. I also think it's a little.
Why are you skeptical, out of interest, just holding on that?
Well, because nations that have, disavowed Taiwan, for instance, that's just one marker you can look at. They never go back. then they go to China, they never go back again to recognizing Taiwan. Doesn't mean it can't happen. I mean, I hope it happens, but it's a nice symbol, but I'm not sure that they're going to do that. I think you also have to ask, what is the function of BRI really? We have to just acknowledge that China has global ambitions. They have 3 global initiatives: Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative, Global Civilizational Initiative. They have global aspirations. So BRI in Latin America is a big part of that because they want to buy influence. They want to expand into our sphere of influence. And that's why it's so important that we have panels like this. But it's not benign in any way. And I just think it's important that we recognize that, we speak honestly about it.
How do you think Constance's map will change of the BRI, of the influence in the next 2 years?
Well, part of it, you keep asking me to predict the future. I mean, I think
because you've got a crystal ball, Mary. I can see you've got one at home. I've seen it.
I think, one of the challenges that we saw in the first term of Trump is that, the nations of Central and South America don't necessarily want to do business with China. They want to be grouped with us. But we don't have a lot of American companies that are coming in and competing for contracts to build roads, to build ports, to build bridges. And that's a problem, and that's given China the ability to come in with BRI and to say, we'll build that for you. We've also largely ignored Latin America when it comes to U.S. diplomatic efforts. I mean, you want the plum postings. You want to go to, Paris. You want to go to Beijing. You don't get the best people going to Latin America. You get the anthropology PhDs who want to go study the native populations, right? I mean, that's who's in the State Department working on LATAM affairs. Until we came into office and we started China Watchers and we put them all around the region and we said, you guys need to sit in country, report back to us, tell us what they're doing, and then let's use our economic officers and figure out how can we help get U.S. businesses in to compete for these contracts. And I hope that those efforts will be reinvigorated and expanded in the second term.
I agree with everything. One of the things that that this discussion has made me think about is the following. I don't necessarily think that China kind of encroaching on this hemisphere has been a bad thing, and I'll tell you why. Mary will say it's a 100% bad thing, but I'll tell you why. Here's the analogy, and I was telling this to John before. It's like when you get married and you tell your wife every day that she's beautiful, right? And then after you're married for a while, you forget to do that, and then she just becomes someone else. But then you go to a dinner party and someone's flirting with your wife, and that gets your attention, right? And so it's a similar situation, I think, with China encroaching in this hemisphere. We're saying, wait, we have this beautiful wife, and we really need to spend more time with her. And I think it's a good thing. Like, I don't love the fact that China is doing this, but I do love the fact that the U.S. is giving Latin America a lot more attention, because we should.
On the prep call we had, you talked about the lack of transparency. We don't really know what's happening with China's involvement. Can we talk about that a bit?
Well, yeah, just again to return to the theme of transparency. I'm sure many of you in the audience aren't aware that for 40 years you're getting extremely limited information about the Chinese leadership, their intentions, their goals. Why is that? Because the normal translators of society, journalists, diplomats, academics, corporate leaders, they're all restricted in going in, even more so today. Whereas their propaganda machine is pushing information out. So you get their story pushed out, and you get very, very limited information that we can ferret out from them. And that's significant. And the unusual thing about this period of history that we've just lived through is, I cannot imagine that any of you doing business here would say, I'm going to go do business in France. It's okay if we can't really go inspect the factory and talk to the factory manager, or we don't really have an independent board. There were all of these exceptions that were made for communist China that we just accepted that would never be acceptable for anybody else. You have to do basic diligence. And so I think that's changing, and I think that's good. But I want to flip, you're talking about sort of the opportunity for Mexico, et cetera. It's not about us. It's also about them. What's their investment environment? Malay has attracted capital because he's reinvigorating animal spirits. Claudia Sheinbaum isn't doing that. I'm not sure I'd touch Mexico. I definitely wouldn't touch Colombia. No way. Who's going to invest in that environment? I wouldn't. I mean, I guess you could, but good luck. So it's not just about us. Get away from the strategic narcissism. It's not all about the United States. It's about the investment environment in these countries, and there are distinct differences between and amongst them in Central and South America, and we need to be honest about that.
Tony, on our prep call, you really wanted to talk about the impact of energy and also interest rates in this. I mean, the whole point of this panel is the intersection of U.S. and Chinese foreign policy. So those two mechanisms, if you like, are really quite crucial in terms of just cogs in the wheel.
Yeah, they are, absolutely. I think on interest rates, the first consideration is, we had zero or negative interest rates, real interest rates, for over a decade. And we have an investment environment right now where money costs money. For the past decade, money hasn't cost money. Now money actually costs money. And so if you're going to invest somewhere and it's a failure, you're not just out that nominal sum, you're out that plus sum, right? And the opportunity cost and everything else. But nobody has thought that way for over a decade because money didn't cost money. In fact, in many cases, you were incentivized for borrowing money, right? So as we look at the risk around investing in a place like China, and as Mary talks about the opacity and lack of control and all this other stuff, and as we saw in the pandemic, there's a single point of failure in supply chains, pharmaceutical supply chains, medical supply chains, electronic supply chains, and so on, right? So we have to, and this is obvious, it's been talked about for 5 years, have to have multiple sources for things or make it domestically, right? And so, so the cost of doing that, although nominally it's larger, the punishment, because money now costs money, is higher for making the wrong investment, right? With regard to energy, there are a lot of considerations, I think, for Mexico. I like Mexico a little bit better than Mary does, but the deregulation of electricity, 15 years ago or something in Mexico, was a huge factor kind of pulling people back into investing in Mexico. I think as we get through these, I would say the next 6 to 9 months with U.S. Mexico relations, I think it will be a much more interesting place. I think designating cartels as foreign terrorist organizations is a big deal, and I think it will help make the environment safer there. I think there's a lot of corruption there that will be, look, there's corruption everywhere. We have corruption in the U.S., so I'm not pointing the finger and saying, Mexico is this corrupt place, but there's a level of corruption that I think may be rooted out. I'm not super optimistic, but it's possible. Excuse me, but I think with energy, looking at where we will get energy, that's where Venezuela becomes a real problem, right? Venezuela has the type of crude that we use in Houston, where I live, to refine to make gasoline in the U.S. and other distillate products, right? We don't really use light sweet crude. I don't know how much you guys know about this, but we take all this crude out of the ground in West Texas, and it's not suitable for the refineries that we have on the West Texas coast, or on the East Texas coast, right? So we have to get oil from Canada or from Venezuela that has the sour crude that we use to refine into products that we use in the U.S. So we have to have a relationship with Venezuela at some point. So my hope is interest rates rise, the dollar appreciates, Venezuela defaults, they have problems, China has problems with CDB and Exim Bank because of a higher dollar, and that will solve a lot of problems.
The U.S. rates significantly affect capital flows, debt servicing. In complete contrast, the Chinese story, of course, changes that. It actually leads to long-term debt issues. How are they going to work together now? How's that going to?
How are China debt issues going to work?
Just the U.S. interest rates in this new.
Oh, China will default. Look, I'm not
it's
entirely.
It's a big statement, Tony. Hang on a minute.
I'm not
China
entirely sure. Well, who are they going to default to, right? But they'll default on themselves. They've been doing it for 20 years. They've just been evergreening these loans for 20 years. So I'm not convinced that Xi Jinping is going to be the chair by the end of the Trump term. So we could see dramatic changes in China 3 years from now. Now, I also don't believe that Xi Jinping being out of power is necessarily the best thing, because we have no idea what comes after that. It could be a reformer, it could be a hardliner.
Why do you not think he'll be in charge in the next
Just
4 years?
little things I hear from people who I know who do stuff in China, and so I don't think he's going to be.
That's a big
there
statement.
are people who talk about some illness that he has. I don't believe any of that stuff.
Right.
But I do believe that the CCP is a very complicated
Very
organization.
complicated and, dare I say, a little bit toxic.
You know, I do believe he's. Although what we see in the Western press is he has this infallible power, but it's not necessarily that way on the ground, and there are factions within the CCP.
And you also raise a point which can be very hopeful, which is that we're terrible at predicting when nations decide to come to our side and want freedom. We completely missed the fall of the Soviet Union. We completely missed the Arab Spring. We missed the 2008 Iranian protests. We missed the ladies in white, the Cuban protests.
That's why we have intelligence agencies to give us the wrong information.
Well, we always miss it. And so, if you think about it, there are really 3 nations in the world that if they became free would completely transform their geographies.
Do you honestly believe that China will become one of those nations?
I think that's a longer answer, not appropriate for here. They don't have the civil infrastructure that a nation like, say, Iran or Cuba would. Those are my 3 nations, China, Iran, Cuba. But let's say that Cuba became free. That would have a transformative impact on our hemisphere. The Maduro regime would collapse immediately. I mean, the Cuban security services are his personal protection details. All of the protests that you think are popular protests in Latin America are not. The Cubans are doing that. It's the Cubans there. Not the Cuban people, the Castro regime, I should say. So, we could see quite a positive, unexpected impact from some of these tougher policies and more U.S. Encouragement of the actual people that suffer under these kinds of regimes.
And Tony, how does that then relate to the Latin American equation, part of the equation?
Cuba potentially falling?
Yeah.
Oh, as Mary says, it would be
What
huge.
Mary just said, that scenario.
Look, I think there are a lot of Americans who want to go. There are a lot of people who want to invest, and part of that is nostalgia, in many ways. But part of it is it's a big, beautiful country just with people that we can't really deal with. So I think there could be a huge amount of investment. There are a lot of cars that I'd like to buy there from the 50s and 60s, which would be really cool. But it would have to be different this time in Cuba because before it was very mafia-centric, right? The American influence there was very mafia-centric. Of course, that couldn't be the case this time. We'd have to have U.S. multinationals and other organizations that would go there and really build relationships.
You know what they say about the Cubans? They're the prettiest, the smartest, the most cultured. They're so great. They had the longest serving dictator in history.
Bring it back, if I can, to the kind of conversation about Latin America. What restrictions or regulatory changes does the U.S. have in its arsenal to impose now on Latin America in terms of China's involvement? What can they do?
I don't think we should think of it as all negative. There are lots of things we can do to attract capital.
That isn't negative. That's just what can they do?
Well,
what actions can they take?
Look, there's AIPA, as Constance talked about, which is presidential executive power. Commerce has certain, punitive powers. The State Department has other powers that it can, impose on individuals or organizations, and we did a lot of that in the first term. But on the other side of it, don't underestimate the attractiveness of the United States. And if we unleash our energy markets, I know we've got an oil trader here in the room, that has a massive deflationary impact, and we start to see animal spirits, and we unleash our capital markets, and we get FDI flooding in, that has an enormous pull, because nobody really wants to invest with China if they're not corrupt, right? And so I think there's an enormous amount we can do on the offensive side to encourage that, whether it's trade agreements. We will rewrite the USMCA, for instance, hopefully in a more competitive, positive direction, and don't carve it out for special interests, but we will do that. I think there are a lot of deals that can be done in this part of the world, and I think, for instance, we're ignoring our northern neighbor when Canada changes governments. I mean, that's going to be an enormous stimulus to the Canadian economy simply by the change of government. So you could see a real boom here between Canada, the U.S., Mexico, nations like Argentina, that provide an example and pressure other democracies in the region, like Chile, like Peru, like Colombia, to elect governments that allow their people the same kinds of opportunities that I think we're about to have.
And do you see that happening?
I do, absolutely.
Yeah, one of the things I like to think about, can we do this in Latin America? There's an old story in China where the Singaporeans built an industrial park in Suzhou, right outside of Shanghai. And at the time, in I think 2002 or something when it was built, it was the premier industrial park in all of China. Everybody wanted to be in the Suzhou Industrial Park because it ran like a Singapore industrial park, and it was clean, and everyone wanted to be there, and other things. I think if the U.S. could build relationships with some of these countries in Latin America and do effectively a Suzhou industrial park once Venezuela changes, consistent power, consistent other stuff, I think that would help because it would be a place where people want to work, where people become accustomed to standards and treatment and other things on American standards, as people did Singaporean standards in China. And so I think there are a number of things that the U.S. can do. Of course, we can say, yeah, we're going to go in and seize the Panama Canal. Of course we can. Panama doesn't really have a military, right? But I think there are other carrots that we can use from an investment perspective, and Trump's talking about the sovereign wealth fund. I don't really like the idea, but if they do that, I think it's something that they could use to potentially invest in places like this. The guy's a real estate developer, so they could go into some of these countries and build world standard industrial parks and incentivize U.S. companies to be placed there, right? So I think there are a lot of things that we can work on, and dollar lending credit lines. Like I think Brazil just had I think $2 billion dollar line that they put out to their companies because they have dollar loans and they couldn't afford to pay them back. So the Brazil Central Bank had to put out $2 billion of concessionary finance in US dollars so they could pay their bills, right? So, we can come to some of those terms to help those countries better pay their US dollar denominated debt.
I mean, if you really wanted to help them, get the IMF out of there.
Oh, yeah.
Because all of the IMF's advice is anti-growth.
Yeah.
So get them out of there. Get their private economies going. Get trade agreements going. Let's have some big thinking. And I think there is that chance under this administration. It's quite remarkable. There's no other democracy in the world that has the capability to rethink how we do business, how we're organized, to look honestly at how our government is actually functioning than this country. I mean, it's incredible. We're very fortunate to live here.
How do you think trade will be disrupted in terms of how extreme, I hate to use that word, will it be, the kind of disruption, dislocation between, in the next, I won't ask you to kind of predict again, Mary, but just how much effect will it have on trade disruption?
It's already been.
I'm a journalist.
It's already been
in my
disrupted.
DNA, I have to ask these negative questions. It's not negative.
I'm a very cynical person, but I'll be positive here. The biggest disruptions have already happened. If you go and you talk to American Fortune 500 CEOs, they will tell you the two biggest shocks they had were, number one, the 3-year COVID lockdown. They never saw that coming. And number two, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and all of the US corporates that, boom, overnight, suddenly had to pull out of Russia. That was a huge wake-up call. Again, just to go back to where we started, that you can't just look at the economic statistics and the capital flows. You have to understand the nature of where you're investing. And that has already started to reshape global trade. It will continue to reshape global trade. Is President Trump a part of that? Sure. But that's been happening now for many, many years. It's a good thing. It's a return to prudence. And I think, again, countries are choosing, investors and businesses are choosing, right, to diversify their risk and to come to environments that are more predictable, more stable, and where they can have, actual rules of law and arbitration when they get into problems. Do you agree with that, Tony?
I do. And, I look at just the U.S. Mexico relationship. And when I was in grad school, my class sat with the guys who had been the UN representatives for Mexico during the Iraq invasion vote. And they were the only ones who voted against it at the UN Security Council. And when we said, why did you do that? They said effectively, Well, because we just wanted to kind of put a thumb in the eye of the U.S. So the U.S. and Mexico have had this really antagonistic relationship since probably the 1840s. Low level, well, not in the 1840s, but after that, low level, but consistent. And I think if Trump could build a relationship with Mexico that would be enduring and not just surface level, I think that would be a game changer. Because it's okay if Mexico has left-leaning governments or far-left governments. I don't care. I just want people to be able to do business there, right? And I think Trump is probably the same way. And I think he has a real opportunity to sit down and say, look, I know we invaded you in the 1840s, right? I know you're upset about that still. But it's a long time after that. And so we need to repair that. We need to fix the anxiety between our countries. And we need to operate as real partners and real neighbors. I think that would be the biggest and best thing that could happen in Latin America for the U.S. and for Latin America, because once that happens, I think the rest of the region just opens up.
But also, I mean, think about the U.S. relationship with Greece. Greece hated us for decades and decades and decades. Now they're our best partner in Europe. I mean, they're small, so they're not, as important as, say, a UK.
Apart from the UK,
Apart from the UK,
which some would say is not in Europe, but I will say it's in Europe.
But the relationship, but he, I think Tony is right. These relationships can last. They can change even after a very long period of time.
On the Singapore-China story, funny because during COVID, a lot of my friends who live in Singapore, their rents. There's so many Chinese, so much Chinese money. I mean, so much Chinese money came to Singapore that literally a couple of friends who've got 2 kids living in the same place for 2 or 3 years, got a call from the landlord, we are doubling your rent tomorrow morning, so pay it or leave, because they had so many Chinese interests. Yep. And Singapore just changed overnight. The money from China is extreme, and because they want to get it out of China, correct?
Yep. Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
No
so that's just
person with wealth in China wants to hold their money in China. They'll buy an empty apartment or a whole building and leave it empty in Singapore as opposed to holding it in China.
I mean, including the leadership.
Yeah, and actually there's an area called Sentosa, which Tony knows very well, which has Linda, my Bloomberg TV former anchor. Well, she's a current anchor, I'm a former anchor. She said that she lives there, and you can look at all the houses, and there are beautiful cars, Rolls Royces parked outside. No one is at home. Yep. And they bought these houses, and it just, anyway, that's a bit of a kind of, diversion. Last question, I want to open to the audience, because they've got a lot of questions, which are fantastic, the two of you. Which countries are at risk, I'm not being cynical, of being left out in the cold in Latin America by this change?
Brazil. As long as Lula is in power, Brazil is a no-go zone.
Okay, on the flip side, which leadership impresses you so much, except for Argentina, maybe?
It has to be Argentina.
Right, but except for Argentina, that will actually step into the room.
Costa Rica. I mean, Costa Rica. I mean, Costa Rica is a major middle market manufacturer for the United States already. For various reasons, but part of that is, the rule of law, sustainability, all the fundamentals that you need, right, to have an attractive investment environment. But I am hopeful that the example of Malay will induce other nations to, vote differently and to insist on more from their leadership. Because I feel for the people of Colombia and Venezuela, et cetera. I mean, they don't want this kind of corruption in these nasty places to live. They want a better life like all of us. So hopefully U.S. policy is encouraging them to, right, make a change for the better.
I think so. I agree with you. Just a last point. Tony mentioned to me outside, have you read The Art of the Deal? And I have not read The Art of the Deal. How many in the room have read The Art of the Deal, out of interest? Because Tony's got a very good point. If you read that, you'll really understand President Trump's strategy.
Yeah, so when I meet people and they complain about Trump, I say, have you read The Art of the Deal? They almost uniformly say no. And I say, buy it used, that way he won't get any money from it, right? But you have to read it to understand how the guy thinks, right? It's just, it's easy to criticize the guy, but you have to understand how he thinks, and that really presents a detailed picture on how he thinks. And it's not PR from 2016, this is from the 1980s. So you can see how he thought when he was young and how that's carried through to today. So buy it used if you want, don't give him any money, but I would say it's a quick read. And so, yeah, check it out.
Not as quick as Walter Isaacson's book on Elon Musk, which is also a very good read, but it's significantly thicker. On that final point from me, I want to open to the audience because I'm sure you have a lot of questions.
So we have a microphone
Francisco.
here and on the other side,
Okay.
if anybody wants to line up and ask a
If
question.
you could just say your name and then off
Hi,
you
my
go.
name is Mateo. Thank you very much for this insightful talk. My question has to do with, we heard a little bit at the beginning, the idea that China's creating this alternate environment to where it can decouple from the U.S. and be able to outcompete it. How does the U.S. then convince its partners, its allies that are currently trading with China to cease trading with China or to start decoupling? Because, for example, you have countries in the EU, I'm from Spain, where China is the largest trading partner after the EU. So that's just my question.
Well, I'll tell you what we did diplomatically. We would go and meet our counterparts, and we would just give them information. We did this, for instance, with Huawei. We got 60 nations and territories and groupings to dump Huawei because it's a nefarious actor. But we didn't go and say, you must dump them. We said, you know what? We're just coming here, and here, look at the intel that we have here. We're your friend. We just want to inform you about what's going on, and you can make your own decisions about it. And once they were informed, they did make their decisions, right? They stripped Huawei out of a lot of sensitive networks. First, our most important partners, our Five Eyes partners, and then other nations did it. Do we need to convince anyone? Well, ultimately, at some point, they're going to learn the hard way, right? We don't actually need to do anything because it's not our behavior that matters. Back to my point about strategic narcissism, it's their behavior that matters. And you can only tolerate losing money, having your people detained, having your IP and trade secrets stolen for so long until you get a CEO or a board that goes, what in the world are we doing and why do we tolerate it here? We would never tolerate it anywhere else. So I think it's a natural decoupling. China's decoupling is a state-led official policy in contrast. People are decoupling to us because they want to be with us. They're decoupling from us because you have a totalitarian regime, which is what's called the dual circulation strategy, that is forcing and corrupting and like a cancer, right? Drawing other nations into them. It's two fundamentally different things with two fundamentally different approaches. I believe our approach is far more attractive, and I think ultimately will prevail. I think that's what history tells us. But we can't take it for granted. And that's why I keep emphasizing, and Tony emphasizes, transparency. All we have to do is talk about how our systems are different. And the choice is very clear. It's very clear that you want to be on our side and not theirs.
Yeah, I'll just tell you a story about my experience within the Chinese government. One morning, I got up early and I watched a speech that Xi Jinping gave because I was in China and it was on every channel. And so I watched it, and then I went into the office and I asked the head of the department. I said, "Hey, I watched this speech this morning," and I asked some questions about the speech. She obviously hadn't watched the speech, and so during the meeting, she started crying and talking about how much she loves her president and how much she loves China. Of course, I'm an American. I'm in a super secret NDRC facility. Everything that we're doing is being listened to, right? But Chinese bureaucrats are crying to show, it was very Stalin-esque, right? To show how much they love their country, and she doesn't want to be hauled off or have her kid kicked out of school or have some punitive thing happen to her, right? So it's a micro, I think, attracting people to the U.S. is a micro discussion, right? It's firm level. What is Huawei doing? How does the Chinese government react? And so on and so forth, right? And I think if you were to ask mid-level or high-level Chinese bureaucrats, not necessarily politicians, but the mid-level and high-level bureaucrats, I think they'd prefer to be here anyway. They send their family here for education, right? They keep their assets here. So if they had confidence in China, they would keep their assets there, but they don't.
Is TikTok and the new Huawei? Obviously, it's very different, but I'm just saying the way it's being dealt with. Mary's looking at me like, what are you talking about? But
TikTok is a really bad thing. It's
no,
not
but
just
it's social media for sure. But the fact that it could be taking data.
It has to be placed in context, and this is where I get frustrated with the question and the discussion. No, sorry. But it's very easy for a politician to say, if we just close down this app, everything will be fine. How many of you have heard of Salt Typhoon? Yeah, we are undergoing the biggest threat to our national security right now in the last 50 years. China has infiltrated all of our networks. They can listen to our phone calls, the content. They can read your text messages, the content. We don't know the intent, and we don't know if they can just shut it off right now. Imagine all of our networks are shut off to our military facilities, our public utility infrastructure, our telecommunications. That's the seriousness of the threat. It's happening right now. The media doesn't understand how significant this is. So what's more important, an app or that? What's more, I mean,
app's part of it there.
the app is a small part.
It's a small part.
The app is
but
a
it's
small
collecting
part.
data.
400 nuclear weapons, million-man
Yeah,
army,
of course.
world's largest navy, third largest air force, biological chemical weapons programs. They attack our satellites every day. Salt Typhoon I just talked to you about. Massive infiltration of the United States. You guys would be shocked. So that's the challenge. That's what we have. And my fear is that we just don't have a lot of time. We work out how to deal with threats in the United States on a bipartisan basis over decades, right? We don't have decades. So this is why I think it's important that we're having this discussion. We're talking about China's nature, its ambitions, right? Tony is talking about their vulnerabilities. This is the threat to us right now. All the good things that are about to happen between the U.S., Canada, Mexico, Argentina, right? We could get into a major conflict if we don't talk honestly about what this threat really is. TikTok, okay, fine. But there's a much larger story there that we need to talk about.
Yeah, I don't have an issue with TikTok per se. I'm a free speech guy, and if I believe that, I could be wrong, but I believe that Meta and Google and all these other guys have the same level of information on us as ByteDance does, right? And so if we're going to say that TikTok can't collect that level of data, we also need to say that Google and Meta and these other companies can't collect that level of data, right? But when it comes to Salt Typhoon, my mobile carrier is AT&T, right? And the fact that they shut down AT&T, and I literally, I'm not kidding, a week later got an email from AT&T trying to sell cybersecurity services to my company. Like you can't, I mean, it's so unbelievably, surreal. And shame on us for allowing our infrastructure to be so permeable. Shame on the US government for our stuff being so permeable. I mean, we should have cyber defenses, but we don't. AT&T should have cyber defenses, but they didn't. So I think on some level, China's just taking advantage of what's easy to get. I mean, it's shame on us for allowing them to do that.
Any more questions? We've got 5 minutes left. We've got 2 more questions.
So that was a really interesting discussion right there. I agree we should worry about China having that level of access to our data. We should also worry about Facebook, Meta, all of them. Maybe we should worry about Elon Musk having this extra access to our data right now. But that's not my question because of the topic. I'm really curious about BRICS, Bitcoin, and the US dollar.
Sure, I'll take that one.
Hang on, was that
BRICS?
BRICS?
Go, Tony,
Was that
go.
Bitcoin in the
BRICS
US
or
dollar.
BRICS?
Gosh, I have been talking about this for years.
BRICS.
Okay, Brazil, Russia, India, China,
As
and
opposed
South
to
Africa.
Brits, British people. I'm just thinking that.
Yeah, not Brits.
I was a bit worried. So is Cameron. He's Scottish.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
British people, super charming.
Thank you very much. Pay you later. I'll pay you later for that. Appreciate it. I'm joking. Yeah.
Aspect.
Right.
It's a great question.
So, first thing, those countries absolutely do not trust each other. Okay? If you just look at China and Russia, how many wars have China and Russia fought? And they came close to war in the 60s as well. So these are countries, India and China, they don't trust each other at all. So these are countries that absolutely do not trust each other. We have Europe with a unified currency, no fiscal control over it, but we have unified monetary policy. I would say Europeans hate each other a little bit less than Chinese and Indians hate each other. They're pulling it off, but I don't see how we can have a BRICS currency with those kind of the lack of trust massive cultural differences, massive monetary policy differences. I would argue that India probably has the strictest monetary policy of those and the most aware monetary policy of those. But the PBOC literally manages interest rates by numerology. Like, look at their announcements. Everything ends in an 8, or it's, you know, I mean, it's crazy town, the way they manage their monetary policy. So, and if you look at it over the years, it's numerology as much as it is economic policy. So there is no way there's going to be a BRICS currency. It's not going to happen. US dollar hegemony, I guess the real question is, so what's the alternative? CNY? I mean, CNY is not an openly traded currency. And you can look at the trading of it. It's very straight lines up and down, right? Very managed currencies. So I don't see any room or justification for a BRICS currency at all. I know people are looking for an alternative to the dollar, and that's fine because they don't like the US. I don't really care. But if you look at the offshore dollar trades, they're massive. The euro dollar is a massive currency in and of itself.
Also, on one thing, one more ingredient. Each leader of those countries is obsessed by their legacy, for me. And that's a big deal. They're obsessed by their legacy.
And their nationalistic
returning
legacies.
their country to its former glory. That's a big obsession, right? And that's back to your magnificent terminology, strategic narcissism. I think that's part of that autocratic
Well,
lens.
just
Please.
on BRICS, I mean, BRICS is just an invention of Goldman Sachs, and Goldman Sachs has been wrong on the trajectory of U.S. growth, particularly under conservative governments, like forever. Why would we expect that they were correct, that BRICS would work? I mean, what's the value there? 0. It's like the global south. What a ridiculous phrase. Why is anybody using it? It's stupid. I mean, countries like South Africa and Argentina are not alike. They never will be. It's ridiculous. It's an elitist way to have a kind of code word for an elitist conversation that's not rooted in reality. I agree with Tony. I mean, maybe it would be good to have a competitive currency system, but there is no alternative to the US dollar right now.
Yeah, the US doesn't want to be 80% of international transactions. That's immense pressure on the Fed. So the US would like it to be less, but there's nobody else out there. So if the US could bring it down to 60%, I think we'd be happy. But it's demand.
One more question. We've got one more question. In the white jacket. Oh, so you're already there?
Yeah,
Okay, 2 more squeeze. Otherwise he'll kill me. Squeeze.
All right.
And then we'll do the gentleman over there. Okay, 1 on 1, then that's it, lunch.
All right. Sorry, my name's Maroon. All right, him first. All right, my name's Maroon. I attend the Miami-Dade Honors College, and knowing Brazil has been a big topic here. What, other than Lula being taken out as president, what steps would you say Brazil needs to take for them to be a flourishing economy again? And would you say that Bolsonaro being back in the presidency is a big step for that?
Just strip the people and the personalities out. I mean, Brazil developed, a developed world's bureaucracy without, the growth that underpinned everyone else developing a big bureaucracy, right? They have a huge state. For Brazil to be made great again, you have to reduce the role of the state. You have to unleash the private sector. So I don't know who that is, who would do that, and I don't want to get into the partisan politics of it, but it's very clear what makes countries grow. And it's not a partisan thing. You can just look at history, right? Why was Hong Kong so rich? Hong Kong is a pile of rocks. Hong Kong is rich because they had a 15% flat tax because you could start a business in 4 hours. And because for many decades, the government didn't actually collect economic data because they knew if they collected it, then they would regulate it. So it became an immensely rich place by the ingenuity and the hard work of its people. That's what needs to happen to Brazil.
And the tycoons.
Ditto. I'll just leave it at that, and we'll get the last question.
Hi, I'm Roberto from Peru. Talking about corruption, the Chinese society corruption at the level of the individuals, they already lost huge amounts of money. 60 billion in Venezuela 10, 15 years ago with Chavez. Do you believe they're able to succeed in a free society, trying to take over or invest or whatever? I know a lot of things are going in Peru. They're trying to play, straight, but they cannot, they're trying to change rules so they can electricity, mining, ports, Basically, their corrupt minds don't allow them to succeed academically or financially over the long term, I'm thinking, and over. What do you think about that?
I'll just go back to Hong Kong. Hong Kong was an immensely corrupt economy until the 60s when the British government said, we're going to set a day. If you come to us and you come clean, you'll have total amnesty. But after that day, we're going to start prosecuting everybody. It was a little bit what like Rudy Giuliani did in New York, right? Day one, the window washers are going away because I'm going to start to enforce things. It is possible for a democratic representative society to go from an extremely corrupt state to a clean economy, a functioning, clean capitalist system. It is possible. It takes immense leadership and immense political courage. And so that's really that's the ingredient that's necessary to get that to happen. Very difficult, but it's possible.
Yeah, corruption happens because you have slack and you have opportunity, right? And so I think, as Mary says, until you have leadership that can come in and make definitive rules and have the power to enforce them. So I moved out of the US in 2003, and I moved back in 2017. And maybe I was young and naive, but the level of corruption here over that period changed dramatically from my perspective, because we had institutions that weren't enforcing the rules, right? And so when in Peru they have institutions, they have leadership that will declare what the rules are, and they have institutions that will enforce the rules, then it'll work. And so just look at the last couple weeks in the US. We have someone enforcing rules around corruption, and media are upset about it. Politicians are upset about it. It's become a politically divisive issue when we're just enforcing anti-corruption rules that are already in place, right? So to have the strength to enforce anti-corruption measures, that person will be exceedingly unpopular for a period of time. And Milei has pushed through it because the media screeched and people screeched and the bureaucracy screeched, and now he's almost on the other side of it, right? Until we have Peruvian politicians who can do that, I don't see how it changes.
On that note, can I thank you for your very candid and very insightful debate or conversation today. Mary and Tony, it's lunch. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody.